I didn't say a word when my son-in-law slid that folder across the kitchen table toward me. I just looked at it, then looked at him, and nodded slowly. He took that nod to mean whatever he wanted it to mean. He was wrong about that, like he was wrong about most things. Let me back up. I'm 63 years old. I spent 31 years working in commercial property development in southwestern Ontario. Not the flashy downtown Toronto kind, but the unglamorous practical kind. Strip malls, warehouses, mixed-use buildings in mid-sized cities that nobody writes magazine articles about. Kitchener, London, Brantford. The kind of work where you show up at 7 in the morning and you know exactly what you're getting into because you've read every clause of every document 3 times before you signed anything. My wife passed 11 years ago. Ovarian cancer diagnosed in October, gone by February. 4 months. I won't dwell on that here because it deserves its own time, and this isn't that story. What it is relevant to say is that after she died, I poured myself into my daughter. She was 24 then, just starting her career, and she was everything her mother would have wanted her to become: smart, driven, funny in that dry, quiet way that catches you off guard. Her name is Ainsley. I am proud of her. I want to be clear about that even now after everything. The man she married, I'll call him my son-in-law because that's what he is technically, his name is Callum. He came into her life about 4 years ago. She met him at a conference in Vancouver. He was charming in the way that some people are charming, which is to say, it takes you a little while to notice that the charm is doing all the work. He was in corporate consulting, which, if you've worked in actual industry the way I have, is a job that mostly involves telling other people what they already know and charging a great deal for the privilege. I didn't dislike him at first. I tried hard not to. Ainsley loved him, and that mattered to me more than my own instincts, which, if I'm being honest with myself, were already raising quiet flags I kept choosing to ignore. He had opinions about everything. The way I ran my properties, the tenants I chose, the accountant I'd used for 15 years. He would phrase it as questions. Have you ever considered a different approach? Wouldn't it be more efficient if... But they weren't really questions. They got married 2 summers ago up near Georgian Bay. Beautiful weekend. I paid for most of it, which I was happy to do. Ainsley cried during her vows, and I cried watching her. And in that moment, standing at the edge of the aisle in a rented tent with the bay just visible through the trees, I thought, let it go, old man. Let her be happy. You don't have to be right. So I let it go. I have a friend named Pete, who used to work in municipal planning before he retired. We've known each other since our 40s, which means we've now known each other long enough that neither of us bothers softening things anymore. Pete never trusted Callum, and unlike me, Pete didn't bother hiding it. After the wedding, Pete took me for a beer at the place we go to on Wednesdays, just a regular pub near the waterfront, nothing special. And he said, you know, he's been asking around about you. I asked what he meant. Asking people in the development community about your assets, what you own, how it's structured, whether you've done any estate planning. I told Pete he was being paranoid. Pete said, maybe. But I've got a friend at Meridian who said Callum came in last spring asking general questions about how family trusts work, specifically in cases where an aging parent-in-law has significant real property holdings. I drank my beer. I didn't say anything. I'm not trying to make your life harder, Pete said. I just think you should know. I went home that night and I sat in my kitchen for a long time. My house is not a fancy house. It's a brick-century home on a residential street in Cambridge that I bought when Ainsley was 2 years old. The kitchen has the same oak cabinets it had when we moved in. I've never seen the point in renovating things that still work. I sat there and I thought about what Pete had said, and then I thought about something I'd noticed 6 months earlier that I hadn't let myself think about too carefully. Ainsley had started asking me questions. Not suspicious questions, not greedy questions, just questions. About the properties. Which ones I owned outright, which ones had financing. Whether I'd thought about succession planning, whether I had a will. I did have a will. I had made it years ago, and I'd updated it after my wife passed. Everything was structured carefully, through a holding company I'd set up in the late 90s on the advice of my accountant, who is a meticulous, unhurried man named Gerald, who has been doing my taxes longer than Ainsley has been alive. The thing about Gerald is that he is the kind of accountant who quietly fixes things before they become problems, and because of that, I had sometimes forgotten how much was actually there. You build things over 30 years. You reinvest. You don't spend lavishly because you don't think about it that way. You think about it as productive capital, not personal wealth. And so it had accumulated quietly in that unsexy way that working class discipline and compound interest produce when left alone for 3 decades. I never talked about it with Ainsley, not out of secrecy, just out of habit. My generation didn't talk about money with their children. You provided, you saved, you kept it private. After the conversation with Pete, I went to see Gerald. Gerald listened to everything I told him, nodding twice, which is a lot of nodding for Gerald. Then he said, "I've been meaning to call you. There are some structures I've been wanting to review with you for the last couple of years, and I think now is probably the right time to get them in order." "What kind of structures?" I asked. He slid a legal pad across his desk. He'd been making notes already, which told me he'd been thinking about this for a while on his own. "Gerald is like that. He sees things before you ask him to. The holding company is sound," he said, "but I want to clean up the beneficiary designations, and I want to look at whether we should establish a family trust for the income-producing properties. It gives you more control over who receives what, and when, and under what conditions." I asked him how long it would take. 6 weeks, he said. "Maybe 8. Let's do it," I said. That was 18 months ago. I want to be precise here because the sequence matters. I went to Gerald. Gerald and I spent several months carefully restructuring. I worked with a lawyer named Helen, someone I'd used on commercial transactions for years, and between Gerald and Helen, everything was redocumented, properly filed, properly held. My primary residence in Cambridge, the 6 commercial properties, the 2 smaller residential rental properties in Guelph, the investment accounts, all of it reviewed, reorganized, protected, not hidden, not done for tax evasion or anything improper. Done because I was 62 years old and I'd never properly addressed estate planning, and it was time. Ainsley knew I was working on something. I mentioned I was doing some financial housekeeping, but I did not tell her the details. Not because I was suspicious of her, because it wasn't finished yet, and I've never been someone who talks about things before they're done. 3 months after Gerald and Helen finished their work, Callum called me and asked if he could come over. Just him, not Ainsley. He said he wanted to have a conversation that was just between us, man to man. I said fine, come for coffee. He arrived on a Saturday morning in March, which was still cold enough that the salt marks hadn't fully washed off the front walk. He came in, refused coffee, sat down at the kitchen table, and after about 45 seconds of small talk about nothing, he opened his bag and slid a folder toward me. "What's this?" I said. "It's a family agreement," he said. "Ainsley and I have been talking about long-term financial planning, and we both think, it makes sense to formalize some things." I opened the folder. It was not a family agreement. It was a drafted legal document, clearly pulled together with some professional help, that would, if signed, establish that a portion of my real property holdings would be considered part of the extended family estate, accessible for joint decision-making purposes, meaning Callum Chirp's purposes, in the event of certain contingencies: incapacity, death, relocation to long-term care. In plain English, if I couldn't speak for myself, Callum would have a seat at the table regarding my properties. I read the whole thing. Both pages. I took my time. Callum sat across from me, and he kept his expression neutral, but I could see the energy in him, the leaning forward energy that people have when they're waiting for a result. I closed the folder. "I'll have to look this over," I said. "Of course," he said. "Take your time." "How long did this take you to put together?" I asked. He shrugged. "We've been thinking about it for a while. Just want to make sure everyone's protected." I nodded. He left 20 minutes later satisfied, I think, with how the conversation had gone. He had delivered his document. I had not reacted badly. He probably drove home telling himself the hard part was over. The hard part hadn't started. I'll tell you what I actually felt in that moment, sitting at the kitchen table after I heard his car back out of the driveway. Not anger. Not even hurt, really, though the hurt was in there somewhere, under other things. What I felt most clearly was a kind of cold, clarifying recognition. Like when you've been trying to make out what's written on a sign from too far away, and then you get close enough to read it, and it's exactly what you thought it said. Pete had told me. I had not wanted to believe it. Now I was holding the evidence in a manila folder on my kitchen table, with a coffee that had gone cold. I called Helen that afternoon. I said, "Helen, I need you to review something and tell me what it would actually do." She read it over the phone while I held on. She was quiet for a long time. "This is a mess," she said finally. "Is it legitimate?" It's drafted just well enough to cause problems, she said. It wouldn't hold up if you challenged it, but if you were incapacitated, it could create delays, disputes. It's essentially designed to give him leverage in a situation where you couldn't push back. I said, "How complete is the restructuring we did?" "Complete," she said. "Everything we did is solid. He would have nothing to grab onto even if he tried." "Good," I said. "I'm not going to sign it." "Obviously," she said. But here's the thing, and this is the part that took me a few days to figure out. I did not want to simply refuse. Because refusing would tell him I understood what he was doing, and that would put him on alert. It would create conflict between Ainsley and me. It would force a confrontation before I had decided what I actually wanted the outcome to be. So I didn't refuse, I didn't sign, I let it sit. I called Ainsley the following week and had a completely normal conversation about nothing. Her work, a trip she was planning to see a friend in Halifax, whether I needed anything. She mentioned the document only in passing, carefully, like she was checking the temperature of water with a toe before stepping in. "Callum mentioned he went to see you," she said. "He did," I said. "Did you have a chance to look at what he brought?" "I'm looking at it," I said. "I've got Gerald looking at it too." She seemed satisfied with that. Or she seemed to want to seem satisfied. I couldn't fully tell anymore, and that was its own quiet grief. I went to see Pete and told him everything. Pete was quiet for a moment, then he said, "What are you going to do?" "I don't know yet," I said. "But I want Callum to understand something clearly before this is over." "What's that?" "That he doesn't know what he was looking at." Let me explain what I mean by that. Callum had done enough research to know I owned property. He knew I had a holding company. That's public information in a general sense. He probably estimated my net worth based on assessed values he could look up, mortgage records, that kind of surface-level due diligence, which is exactly the kind of research a consultant does, fast, broad, enough to make a presentation. What he didn't know, because it's not the kind of thing that shows up when you look from the outside, was how the restructuring Gerald and Helen had done actually worked. The properties were no longer held personally. They were held inside corporate and trust structures with specific, legally documented succession arrangements. Ainsley was named as a beneficiary in ways that protected her directly, not through a spouse. The income from the properties flowed through a family trust with me as the trustee and discretionary beneficiaries that could be adjusted based on circumstances. In plain language, what Callum was trying to put his hands on didn't exist in the form he thought it did, and any document he drafted based on his research was pointing at a shadow. Gerald explained it to me again one afternoon, sitting in his office with the same unhurried patience he'd had for 25 years. If he took this to court, which I don't think he could, you haven't signed anything, he would spend a great deal of money to discover that the assets he's targeting aren't titled the way he thinks they are, and that the trust has terms that supersede any informal family agreement. I asked what would happen if I became incapacitated. "The trustee's succession is documented," Gerald said. "It goes to an independent trustee, not a family member, with Ainsley receiving income according to the terms. Her spouse has no role. So there's no door," I said. "There's no door," Gerald said. I sat with that for a week, and then I decided what I wanted to do. I called Ainsley, and I asked if the three of us could have dinner. I said I'd been thinking about the document, and I wanted to talk about it in person together. First, we went to a restaurant in Guelph, the kind of place with paper on the tables and good food without being pretentious about it. Ontario winter outside, dark by 5:30, that particular kind of February that makes you appreciate having somewhere warm to be. We talked about nothing for a while, and then I said, "I had Gerald and Helen look at what you brought over." Callum nodded, neutral face. "I'm not going to sign it," I said. Callum started to explain very calmly that it was really just a formality, that it was about making sure everyone was protected. "Callum," I said. He stopped. "I'm not angry," I said, "and I'm not going to make a scene. But I want you to understand something. Gerald and Helen spent 14 months restructuring my holdings. Everything is inside a trust. The independent trustee is already named. Ainsley's income interests are protected separately, directly to her. What you put in that folder was pointing at assets that don't exist in the form you thought they did." The look on his face, I won't call it anything dramatic, because it wasn't dramatic. It was more like watching someone do arithmetic in their head and getting a result they didn't expect. He looked at the table. He looked at Ainsley. Ainsley was quiet. I said, "Ainsley, I want you to know that everything I've done is to protect you. not to punish you, not to shut you out. Helen can walk you through exactly how the trust works, and you'll see that it's designed to make sure you're provided for directly on your own. She looked at me. Her eyes were bright, which means she was working hard not to cry. Dad, she said. We don't have to do this all tonight, I said. But I wanted you both to know where things stand. Callum said almost nothing for the rest of dinner. He was polite. He ate his food. But the math had changed for him, quietly and completely, in a way I didn't need to point out more than I already had. The drive home was an hour. I took the long way along the back roads, the way I always have since my wife and I used to take Sunday drives along the same route when Ainsley was small and would fall asleep in the back seat before we got home. The fields were dark and snow-covered, the kind of landscape that doesn't look like much in photographs but is genuinely peaceful when you're inside it, moving through it. I had not yelled. I had not threatened. I had not made a production of anything. I had simply done the work, years before anyone came looking, and I had waited for the moment when the doing of that work would speak louder than anything I could have said. That was 4 months ago. Callum and Ainsley are still together. I don't know what that looks like from the inside. I can't know. Ainsley and I have had 2 long conversations since that dinner, and she's been honest with me in the way that a person is honest when they're still working something out themselves. She didn't know the full extent of what Callum had been planning. I believe that. I believe she was told it was about protecting the family, and she believed him, and that's a painful thing to sit with, but it's her thing to sit with, not mine to manage for her. She is her mother's daughter. She's smart enough to see things clearly once they're in front of her. Gerald turned 70 this year. We had lunch to celebrate, and he picked up the tab, which he's never done before in 25 years. He said, "I'm proud of the work we did. It was the right time." He was right. It was the right time. Pete still meets me on Wednesdays. He never said "I told you so," which is one of the reasons we've been friends as long as we have. He just nodded when I told him how it had gone and said, "Good. Now let's talk about hockey, because there's nothing else to be done about it." There wasn't. I file everything. I always have. Every contract, every amendment, every letter from every lawyer, every accountant's note going back to 1991. People used to tease me about it. My wife used to say I was the only man she knew who filed birthday cards. Maybe she was right, but 31 years in commercial property will teach you that the documents always tell the story, and the person who prepared the right document first is almost always the person who ends up on solid ground. I built what I built over a lifetime of early mornings and boring meetings and unglamorous work in mid-sized Ontario cities. I protected what I built quietly, with help from people I'd trusted for decades, long before anyone came to look at it. And when someone finally did come looking, all they found was a door that had never been there.